everybody, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, one of the latest initiatives brought to you by the Texas National Security Review, featuring the leaders and thinkers based at the University of Texas, or in other cases, those who stop by to share their wisdom. I'm your guest host today, Aaron O'Connell. I'm a faculty fellow here in the Clements Center and an associate professor of U.S. military history here at the University of Texas at Austin. My guest today is the always brilliant Charles N. Edel, a senior fellow and visiting scholar at the U.S. Studies Center at the University of Sydney. Previously, Charlie served on the U.S. Secretary of State's policy planning staff and was an associate professor of strategy and policy at the U.S. Naval War College. He holds a PhD in history from Yale University, and his first book, Nation Builder, John Quincy Adams and the Grand Strategy of the Republic, was published by Harvard University Press in 2014. Welcome, Charlie.
Thanks so much for having me on, Aaron.
So, Charlie, you're here to talk a little bit about your latest book, co-authored with Hal Brands, entitled The Lessons of Tragedy, Statecraft and the World Order, which has just come out from Yale University Press. Congratulations.
Thanks very much.
I noticed that it is #1 in new releases for ancient and classic history.
To take the risk of offending every classicist out there, that is an exceedingly low bar.
But great. So let's give our listeners a little bit of an overview of your book and its main arguments, and then we'll see what kind of relevance we can pull out of the discussion for contemporary events. So why don't you just start with the, just a big picture overview. Why did you decide to write this book in the first place?
Sure. Well, the true answer is that I wanted to prove to my parents that being a classics major was okay. I could find gainful employment or somewhat gainful employment after that. Look, Mom, Dad, I wrote a book. It's about the ancient Greeks. But I think the main thrust of what we were trying to do here when Hal and I decided that we were going to write this is to make the argument that Americans have forgotten why we do what we do. Because the historical distance has grown and the visceral experience of having been confronted with a true buckling of the international system has faded, those memories have faded. A lot of the things that America does for its deeply engaged position in the world, the logic of that seems to have receded as well. And so there are lots of questions, as we all know, that are floating around right now. Why is it that America has military equipment stationed abroad, including men and women in uniform? Why do we have alliances all over the world? Why do we have trade relationships that sometimes come at the short, medium, and sometimes even long-term cost to certain workers and industries? And the answer, for the most part, is very historical, because when America hasn't done that, we see really bad things from happening. But because that memory has really faded, the logic of doing that seems to make less and less sense. And it's our argument that it's making less sense, this amnesia is setting in, just as the international environment is becoming more fraught.
Okay, yeah. So it's interesting. You and I both went through the Grand Strategy program at Yale. And of course, they had the rather controversial notion that even the ancient Greeks had something to offer us today. This idea that you could probe the past for transferable lessons of history, things that apply to this day. And so one of the things I was surprised by in taking a look at this book is that, it's these are the ancient Greeks. This isn't just history. This is quite literally ancient history. And I think that, you in government, we both spent time in government. It's often, you wouldn't do very well if you started your conversation at a policy planning meeting or at a National Security Council meeting with, well, let me tell you about the ancient Greeks.
You probably wouldn't do well if you ended the meeting that way either.
So the real question here is, why did you pick the ancient Greeks, other than to please your parents, which is a totally valid reason? But more broadly, what kind of transferable lessons can we pull out of a time so long ago and such a different system from the world system today?
It's a great question, Aaron. It's really the argument of the book that tragedy, and when we say tragedy, we're talking true bucklings of the international order, complete with great power war, mass human suffering on a grand scale, that these tragedies are more frequent than we might imagine, and that we're closer to one than we might think. And that's today.
So that's a similarity, whether the ancient Greeks or today, whole systems collapse with incredible calamity for all involved.
Correct.
Yeah.
But what we thought was interesting was not starting it with today, but rather with a puzzle. Because the ancient Greeks, in some ways, the ancient Athenians in the 5th century, the greatest, most high-achieving civilization. They birthed us modern democracy. They had a navy that ruled the waters. They had an empire that straddled the Mediterranean. Their political system really was the most liberal one that they had at the time and was the pride of their citizens. We still think about it. And yet, in the midst of this, their civilization put tragedy as the core of their civilization. They had state-funded theater that everyone went to, and they made everyone sit on the theater benches, and they would sit there and watch the good and the great fall, suffering catastrophic consequences from errors of ignorance, from errors of hubris, from errors of commission and omission. And the point was not only to scare the bejesus out of themselves, but it was really a Greek insight that the best way to avoid tragedy was to think constantly about it. That it was only by thinking about tragedy, by keeping it in front of you, that you would be willing to take somewhat unnatural actions as a society, collectively, that you could spur yourselves into taking actions that would wrench events from their course. So that's why they kept tragedy in front of them. And because we've experienced ups and downs in U.S. foreign policy over the last 70 plus years, but we have also experienced nothing resembling great power war for 70 plus years. We've had no real competitor since the end of the Cold War. That idea of tragedy seems to be more and more of an impossibility in many people's minds, just as the system becomes more fraught. So we want to use this frame of tragedy to think about it. And the one thing that I'd add here is that the Greeks, the ancient Athenians, were not a pessimistic people. They kept comfort with their worst fears in order to spur them creatively onto what they could do collectively as a community.
Yeah, I think this is one of the most remarkable insights of the book. We spend a lot of time throwing around names like Steven Pinker to say, my God, the world is healthier, wealthier, better off now than it ever has been. And by a number of metrics, that's true. But what I hear you saying is there's a cost to a lot of that comfort. And part of the cost is that people forget that the world is far more likely in its long history to be beset by serious calamities than it is to live in the semi-artificial, human-constructed, always policed international order that has only existed since our grandfather's lifetime at the best. So I think that's an important starting point. So the whole book is framed around this notion of tragedy, and you have this fabulous phrase of our leaders need a tragic sensibility. So can you give us, sort of an example? What does a tragic sensibility entail? What are some of the...
Let me actually back up if I can before we get to that, because we have a whole list of prescriptions of what a tragic sensibility entails. But one of the ways that we wanted to think about tragedy was if it is the norm as much as it is the exception, and that's the really bad news and the horrifying news and the shocking news, which we can stand some shocking, frankly, it can also have a silver lining, right? Because if you are willing to learn from the lessons of tragedy, if you're willing to think that that was horrible, we don't want to go back there, you're willing to take actions as a community, as an international society at times, that would help to stave this off. And so in some ways, and this is how the argument unfolds in the book, if tragedy is a curse for those who live it, for those who come after it, who have survived it, it can serve as an inspiration. And so we track through, the horrible, clumsy subtitle that I am responsible for, I'm sure, is The Lessons of Tragedy, Statecraft, and International Order. And the last two words really matter here because we talk about the horrors of the 30 Years' War, but what comes afterwards, right? Westphalia. Yeah. We talk about the horrors of the Napoleonic Wars, but what comes afterwards?
Concert of Europe.
And we talk about the horrors of World War I and what comes after.
League of Nations.
Well, so there are different ways that you can learn and respond to tragedies. It's a actually pretty normal human reaction when you have been scarred that much to say, never again, and therefore I don't want to engage. But it's a better reaction, we argue, and generally a more stable reaction that it produces when you're willing to take actions that harness the resources of multiple powers, that is informed by historical knowledge of working to stave off and prevent another tragedy from happening.
Sure. And just to carry your historical examples forward, say a few words about World War II, because that is what births the international order we live with today.
This is a pretty short book. I mean, you've already mentioned Steven Pinker. I mean, we basically name names, right? We're trying to offend as many people as possible in this book, and I think we succeed wildly.
Mission accomplished, Charlie.
And we say Steven Pinker's argument. I mean, there's so much validity in there too, but Steven Pinker's, and there's another variant of this. We heard this with President Obama speaking very eloquently, right? That if you closed your eyes, if you want to imagine any moment in time that you would like to live, you would undoubtedly choose now. That is true, certainly from my perspective. But that doesn't negate the fact that the international order seems to be eroding on its foundations right now, too. And as for Pinker's argument, and it's not worth really hashing out here, but it is worth noting that he's right. People are healthier. People are more prosperous. People live longer. But we also went through 2 world wars in the 20th century. And that's a pretty catastrophic calculus. So you asked about World War II, and this is really in some ways the hinge point of the book. So we talked about Westphalia, or you and I briefly glanced over Westphalia. We looked at the Concert of Europe. We looked at the post-Versailles settlement, the interwar years, as a counterexample. And then we have an entire chapter devoted to the post-war settlement. And, when we look back retrospectively today, 1945 seems like a bright, shining line, right? From all the bad things, the horrible things that happened in the first half of the 20th century, and the relatively good things. And they're not even relatively. We can say they are good things, right? The advancement of prosperity on a global scale, the advancement on the number of democracies, certainly great power peace, although there are a lot of bloody conflicts during that period. And that comes from deep American involvement and engagement. But, it's an error to think that, to look back and say that they knew consciously what they were doing in constructing this, because many informed observers thought, having lived through World War I, having lived through World War II, that it was inevitable, especially with Moscow's rising power, that you were going to head towards World War III. Well, thankfully, it wasn't inevitable, right? But it wasn't inevitable because of the conscious efforts that America took with its allies and partners. And it was a memory, it was actions really that were informed by what had happened before. And, I think at one point, I'm not sure if it was Dean Acheson or someone else who said that, the story of the 20s and 30s was as well known as the story of the Garden of Eden for my generation. And it was informed by what they thought were the lessons that they pulled out of the 20s and 30s, that when you failed to stand up to aggressive powers pushing on friendly nations, when you allowed protectionism and trade wars to break out, when you refused to speak up for democracy and democratic institutions, it created a power vacuum and was an invitation to chaos. So we can think of that in some ways as the glue, the logic really, that spurred the great efforts and the successes of the post-war order. And, everything from a relatively free economic order, a security architecture that was meant to deter aggression and promote stability, the advancement of democracy and democratic institutions, the norming of principles such as non-aggression. And so the thing that we pull out of this that I think the policymakers, and again, this is right in the middle of the book, because this was the tragic sensibility that really drove them, was it was essentially a logic predicated on preventative action, right? That it was cheaper to pay some costs up front than pay enormous costs later. It was better to pay the cost of maintaining the order than to have to come in after it had collapsed. That was the logic that drove the American-led order. But it's also one that, as we've removed ourselves historically from it, that logic, that preventive logic, that yes, it's created positive sum goods, although they're not equally distributed, but it's also meant to stave off really bad things from happening.
Yeah, that makes excellent sense. I'm thinking now, as you've gotten us from Westphalia through World War II. Well done. Let me take us back to the ancient Greeks. One thing that I've been thinking about is if I wanted to mark a difference between the sensibility, a tragically informed sensibility in the ancient world and today, is that it seems to me that in the ancient world, people were much more comfortable with brutality. people were dying every day of all kinds of things. And the idea of slaying your enemies or parading them in front of the guests at the theater was really quite common. And so I wonder if part of having a tragically informed sensibility is a way to say having a higher tolerance for the use of force. Certainly, the idea that we would call off military operations because we've had one bad day or one endeavor went awry, or even something as tragic as missing a target and killing a bunch of civilians, that could cause a week of alarm in the national security community today in the United States. I don't imagine that would have caused ancient leaders to blink. So is part of this tragic sensibility just a harder-nosed realism, or just an ability to tolerate higher levels of violence than we are used to in the contemporary political environment?
That's a really interesting way of putting it. Absolutely, it's part of a tragic sensibility, and I don't think we put this in there. So this is like, for the afterword of the next version, is that it's not costless and it's not antiseptic. And in fact, I would quibble a little bit with what you said, Aaron. The fact that the ancient Greeks, they weren't little namby-pambies like we were. They weren't worried about a higher body count that wouldn't call off their operations, because sometimes it did. And one of the things that we discuss in the book is, look, we discussed the great tragedies of the stage, right? That most of us read or pretended to read in high school English. But we also discussed Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War actually as a tragedy, right? He went to the theater, he saw these. There are actors, there are speeches, there's the scripting of different acts of this. There are books, much like acts in it. And the most interesting speech, probably the most famous speech in the book, is Pericles' funeral oration, right? It's the model of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. And it's interesting if you actually think about this. It speaks to your question a little bit. Because in the funeral address, Pericles is elected to be the funeral orator, right? After you bury your war dead, you would elect a prominent citizen to commemorate them, right? Think of Lincoln at Gettysburg. And what he says is, I'm here to consecrate their sacrifice, and here to make sure that every citizen is forward in the defense of our democracy, of our republic, right? That these have not died in vain. I mean, Lincoln consciously drew on this. Gary Will's beautiful book, Lincoln at Gettysburg, lays that out. But what's fascinating in the Peloponnesian War is, Thucydides is a crafty guy, and he wants you to have certain reactions. So the very next scene that happens after his beautiful funeral oration, where he's telling people not to be set back, to think about the values and the interests of the state, is this horrible plague breaks out. And the first thing that happens when it breaks out is the citizens say, let's sue for peace now, before even the plague sweeps the city. And Pericles goes back up again and says, you've forgotten what I said.
Were you here yesterday?
Because we have to stay steady in this. The other thing that I'd say that kind of leaps to mind, because we are talking about theater a little bit, and I think that this is important. And it's, again, why I used the frame, why Hal decided to use the frame of Greek tragedy. It's because it's performative art. And the way that it happened, I've already talked about the fact that it was subsidized by the state. There was a religious holiday. Every citizen was drunk on wine when they went there, and they sat there for a couple of days watching this stuff. But if you think about what it meant when they sat there watching this, the citizens would parade into the theater. The front row would be reserved for the 10 generals that were elected from the people. The war widows and orphans would then come in next and sit next to them. Resident aliens would then get seats of honor, both because they were allies and partners, and so that they could witness how great and powerful Athens was. And when they saw these tragedies unfolding on the stage, you have to remember that when this was acted out, there are heroes and there are heroines, if you think of all those different ones, right? Antigone, there's so many heroines, but every heroine was played by a young man, not played by a woman. And all these young men were about to take up arms for the state. And so some of the different tragedies that we look at in the book, and again, this is not ancient literary criticism, it's used as a vehicle to discuss this larger argument that we're unfolding, is to make the point, and this had such poignancy in Athens, that these were the people about to go take up arms to bear costs in life to defend the state and defend its democratic institutions.
That's fascinating. I mean, let me push back just briefly on this, which is I grant the larger performative value of having your generals in front parading in guests, and also of having the young men who are acting on the stage getting ready to take up arms. But if I were to stupidly try to apply that to the present and do so without the wisdom you have, I would say you're calling for even more militarization of American society or world society, even more veneration of the warriors, even more overt nationalism, which it sounds like all of these were performances of. I'm hesitant to think that that's what you're calling for. Is it?
It is not what I'm calling for, although I think that nationalism has got a pejorative name to it. What else is a citizen going to venerate other than its nation? Nationalism has a pejorative connotation because we associate it with great upheavals, but citizens being forward in defense of their nation, and forward in defense, I don't simply mean from a militaristic angle. That's what one would expect out of patriots. So in terms of more militarization, no, that's not, I don't think, what we're advocating here, but I do think we are advocating recognizing that the international order has become more fraught. And as it becomes more fraught, and as the democracies of the world are in recession, and the illiberal authoritarian states, chiefly led by China, no less Russia, are advancing, there are actions, some of which come in military in scope, that we have to be prepared to think more about than we had in the past, because the geopolitical environment in which we're in is fundamentally different than it was previously.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And just as you're speaking, it makes me think that usually when we talk about either venerating the military or celebrating military service, it goes into two boxes, neither of which are adequate, right? Overt militarization or overt pacifism. But there's a middle ground there, one that I've thought a lot about, because what you can't have in a society, if it's going to succeed, it seems to me, is military illiteracy. And that it is fairly common among a number of citizens in the United States who have no idea how large the military is, where it's deployed overseas, how many nations it's using deadly force in right now. So it seems that part of patriotism or just civic-minded citizenship should be at least an awareness of where your military is and what it's doing, which isn't necessarily a call for more military force, more military veneration.
I completely agree. I think that was really well said, that if we have a big military and we use it to, in some ways, backstop the favorable conditions in the world that we're talking about, and citizens of this country and others pay for it, you should know what your tax dollars do and what they accomplish. I'd say one other thing, though, that I'd add on this one, and then we'll move to a new theme if you want, which is this idea of celebrating the military. There was a great piece that came out in The Atlantic about 2 or 3 years ago by Jim Fallows. I forget which version of the name it had, but Chicken Hawk Nation in some ways was the title. And it was his argument that we used to actually think a lot about what our military did and where it fell short. And we criticized it because every citizen had basically served in it during World War II. As that distance has grown, one, as we've moved to an all-volunteer force, and three, frankly, as a lot of citizens feel guilty that they don't have skin in the game, there's been less and less ability of the average citizen to critique the military. If we flash back to ancient Athens, there was no such thing. First of all, because everyone served. This book is not a call to abolish the AVF. That's a different type of discussion. But understanding that this is a public good that we all contribute to, we all own, and that we all need to think about how it's most wisely employed, that's a small d democratic understanding of what the military is and its place in our society.
Well said. Well said. Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, maybe we should switch to sort of narrow down a little bit and talk about the United States a little bit. You've spent a fair amount of time writing about the founding fathers, so maybe we could start right at the beginning.
Absolutely.
If we were to pick perhaps an early leader or leaders that displayed tragic sensibilities, are there any that come to mind?
Absolutely. The authors of the Federalist Papers. For those of you teachers out there, reassign the Federalist Papers. The Federalist Papers are a fascinating document, right? Because they're really written on the fly. I mean, they were op-eds. Of course, it's Alexander Hamilton, so it's like a 10,000-word op-ed every day for like 30 days in a row. A human word machine.
I think the most writing in the world goes Alexander Hamilton Hal brands everybody else. But that's a conversation for another day. Maybe Hal brands his dad.
No comment on there, but I think you've got some truthiness in there. They're both really productive and amazingly clear. We'll focus back on Hamilton here.
Yes.
But if you read the Federalist Papers, right, written by, co-authored by John Jay, only the first 5, then he gets sick and drops out, Madison and Hamilton, these are really historically, tragically informed essays. And I say they're written on the fly, but it's kind of amazing because they're written on the fly. In some ways, they're our most profound statement of American political philosophy that exists. What I find really interesting in them, and we don't go into this too much in the book, although I've done some fiddling and writing on this elsewhere, is that we generally think of the Federalist Papers as a statement of not only the separation of powers and the enumeration of what those powers are for the constituent branches of the federal government, no less what's devolved to the state level. But that's not all that they were. Because first of all, the Constitution came out of as much a foreign policy crisis as it did a domestic crisis. And John Jay, of course, who was the chief diplomat, who was really the lead and the most senior guy, he took the lead and wrote the first 5 before he got sick. And if you take account of the 85 or so essays in the Federalist Papers, by my count, there are 30 plus, maybe more than that are wholly constituted on national security matters. And the subject matter that they're dealing with is oftentimes the ancients, right? The ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans. And the reason for this, I don't think I would limit it just to these 3 authors. If you look at almost all of the founders, they had a profound knowledge coming out of the Enlightenment of the classics. And to them, this was their world, because here they were, a very small, almost indefensible republic, and they're trying to do something that they hadn't been able to do, and they're trying to survive and expand both geographically and the scope and power of their institutions and their ideas in a world of hostile, illiberal states. We call them monarchies and empires, right? So the idea that they had this wonderful thing that they were trying to create, that's very much there in the Declaration and in the Constitution. But it is informed by this tragic sensibility that danger was lurking almost everywhere.
Yeah. It's an amazing perspective because you have at the same time extraordinary backwards looking. There is no way to read the Federalists or the writing of the Founding Fathers without realizing that they're thinking of a republic in terms of the other republics they've studied from the past. And then at the same time, it's incredibly self-consciously new. They know they are creating something different, looking to the future, and believe that they're bringing something new to the world. So it's almost that balancing act, right? How to look forward while being cognizant of looking back.
So let me flash forward a little bit too, because you can point to many American leaders, many American thinkers who had a tragic sensibility. I think the post-war generation, which we've already discussed, really displayed it. But it's backward-looking and it's forward-looking. It's pessimistic and it's optimistic. In some ways, this is a lesson of Greek tragedy, right? This horrible stuff is happening, but don't be paralyzed by it. In some ways, right, the gods are always mucking around in the Greek tragedies, but what's celebrated is not people succumbing to their fate. It's people who are willing to take action in the advent of a world that you can't possibly know the outcome. And so when you begin to think about American leadership in the post-war world, it's predicated on these ideas. First, that there is something that we have to be fearful about, and we have to take action to stave that off. And it's constant and it's enduring, no matter how unfun that is to say. The second thing is that you can't do it without inspiring people and providing hope of a better future, both here domestically and abroad as a project, if we want people to sign up for this. The third part, though, and you started talking about this with leadership, and this changes and shifts, I think, in the post-war environment as opposed to the founding generation, is the difference is, and I think, sometimes we lapse into this ahistorical way of thinking that if you just look back to the Cold War, which, by the way, wasn't so great, but if you just look back to that golden age of bipartisan consensus, well, first of all, read your history. It was not that golden, it was not that bipartisan. But we sometimes, even when we do look at that, we say, but you know what? It was pretty easy to convince the American people because of the threat of the Soviets. And that's partially true. But it also forgets the fact that this was always a difficult argument to make, right? We have 2 oceans separating us. We're blessed with our neighbors, Canada and Mexico. threats seem very far away oftentimes. And frankly, after World War II, we were so much more prosperous because almost the rest of the world was on its back. And what we forget is it's never been an easy argument, but it is one that every American president until this point has felt that it was necessary, no matter what they thought coming into office, to make to the American people, that this was in their interest to do this.
Yeah, that's right. It seems most presidents, they may not do it through theater, but they've grasped, or at least conventional theater, political theater, but they've grasped that one of the hats they wear as president is inspirer-in-chief, and that if they cannot rally the Americans towards a common cause, then they aren't doing their job as well.
Well, hold on. Let me spin that a little bit differently, because they are, and I think they understand that they have to be inspirer-in-chief because you can't only run on fear. But you can't only run on hope either. And so if you think at some of the presidents who did this best, Harry Truman, it's a positive-looking vision where he says that all of you, when he's asking for funding, right, on the Truman Doctrine, he said, all of you who lived with me through World War I and World War II know exactly what is happening here. When you think of Ronald Reagan, we think of the hopeful vision, but also making sure, if you think of the first half of his presidency at least, painting the threat in rather stark terms. So it is this balance, which is a very ancient idea as well, that you have to get right. It can't be one and it can't be the other. But it's our argument in the book that we might have erred a little bit too far at this point towards the hope and have forgotten about the fear part of the buckling of the international order.
Sure. And when you say hope, right, my mind immediately goes to President Obama. But maybe let me ask about the post-September 11th Freedom Agenda, which is a deeply optimistic and grand, hubristic vision of transforming the world, that what we have and the systems we have are what everybody wants, and that if we just offer it, then any old system might fall away. Is the George W. Bush Freedom Agenda an example of part of this amnesia of missing a tragic sensibility? Or, in fact, was President Bush tragically informed as well?
So I think it's actually a little bit of both, right? That it is, in one sense, inspired by this. In fact, so is Vietnam, right? The interventions into both Vietnam and Iraq in some ways come out of this project, right? Because I've already said that I think that part of this project means a constant vigilance to be forward engaged, to be pushing back against competitors. But the logic of that can lead you into some errors and to some, as you said, hubristic errors, right? I mean, we know that when we think back to, for me, it was 10th grade English with Miss Mallison, the one word that leaps out of your mind most is hubris, right? And so, yes, the ancient Greeks' tragedies teach us that we need to take action to wrench horrible events off their course. But they also have a lot to say about hubris, about the overreach, about things that are beyond the capabilities of humans or of governments. And so when we think about Vietnam, we can say that this was part of that project. But we can also say that it didn't achieve the political objectives that it was intended to, and also ushered in a period of doubt on the American people as the international environment through the 70s grew more fraught. When we talk about the contemporary crisis of American internationalism, there are lots of causes that we could point to, but a lot of it has to go back to 2003. And
invasion of Iraq, I think, is what you're referencing.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Aaron. And look, there's a healthy debate to be had. There's one that's ongoing in scholarly, academic, and political communities about the initial wisdom, the ultimate winnability of both of those wars. But I think we can say that when the American people feel that their government and their leaders have overreached, or that they've stumbled into a quagmire, they're unwilling to support further efforts, even when those efforts are necessary. And the bad part of this is there's no magical solution. There's not a formula that tells you how to weigh the cost of inaction against the cost of action. And part of the challenge here is noting, I think, and in some ways, right, that's why American foreign policy swings between doing way too much and way too little. And so a part of the tragic sensibility that we try to point out as well is, yes, action, but also a decent amount of reflection and restraint in some circumstances in order to understand that there's danger that lurks at both extremes.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, we should be fair to say that even the ancients overreached. Even they had their Sicilian expedition. So to be fair to your argument, you're not sort of suggesting that the solutions to all contemporary problems lie in just reading a few plays. It is rather a set of principles that you see present in how the ancients looked at the world, looked at safety, looked at obligations and service. And it seems you're seeing that some of those principles are missing in the contemporary environment. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. And I would quibble potentially with how we describe the Sicilian expedition of the Athenians and whether or not they actually allocated the proper amount of resources towards it. But that's an argument that really only like 10, maybe 15 people care about. But yes, I think that's the essence of the argument.
Charlie, you've spoken a lot about Thucydides today, and as you were doing so, you made me think of Graham Allison's famous book, The Thucydides Trap. And so I'd just like to ask you, obviously you're not responding directly to Allison here, but that major point in his book that just by nature of power, rising powers and status quo powers are headed into conflict. How would someone with a tragic sensibility or someone who has read your book think about these topics now?
Yeah, Professor Allison's book, The Thucydides Trap, Aaron and I have had trouble pronouncing this word, so we're working on saying it. Thucydides.
It's a very difficult thing to say.
Thucydides. The thesis in Professor Allison's book, which you just characterized, is that rising powers and status quo powers go to war, and that's really bad. And look at China and the U.S. Look at where we're headed, unless ... And then we can debate in the conclusion of that book whether or not there is policy recommendations or not, or if there are allusions to accommodations in certain areas or not. And I think it's a really provocative thesis. It's one that's obviously had a lot of people thinking about it. I think one of the things that we want to interrogate a little bit here is whether or not you see models of escalation, spirals of escalation, or deterrence when you push back against powers. Because I've written a separate article on this, not only about this, but there's also Hugh White, who's a big scholar in Australia, wrote a book called The China Choice, that small countries like Australia will be forced into a choice. And ho-hum, we don't like the world that we're in, but we see the power dynamics, we see which way things are going, so we have to make the choice, and it's not with America. And I think these are really important questions. They are the questions of our time. But I think they have a couple of assumptions that I would quibble with. So the first is that not everything that you do in response leads to thermonuclear exchange. The distance between here and there is vast. And saying that pushing back against China or other revisionist powers will inevitably trigger the threshold into thermonuclear war or even a shooting conventional war, I think vastly inflates the threat and misunderstands our recent history. And so, it's an important corrective to note that when President Obama declared and clarified our commitments to Japan around the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea in 2013, it seemed to suppress Chinese probes. When President Obama pushed back against Xi Jinping and asked him in no uncertain terms to stop the cyber intrusions, or there would be some sanctions coming their way, it stopped them for a while. Of course, they came back, and we're seeing now an uptick. Famously, when President Obama discussed a red line, not in public, but around the reclamation of Scarborough Shoal, that seemed to have had effect. And it's not just the United States. If you look at what the Indians have done, pushing back against the Chinese up in Doklam, it's unclear sometimes who lost face, who won face, but there was no war. If you look at what the South Koreans have done, when the Chinese began exerting economic pressure on them to not install the THAAD anti-missile shields, you know what? The South Koreans said, frankly, this is a matter of national security and we'll install them. Now, only 2 instead of 6. But there was no severance of ties there, too. So the point is, if you actually look at this, the Chinese don't out-escalate us in every circumstance. There are some things that are core interest to them, of course. But to imagine that everything is, by definition, a red line that triggers thermonuclear exchange is to self-deter ourselves.
Well, Charlie, I think that's about all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us here on Horns of a Dilemma. And I know everybody will look forward to buying and reading your fabulous new book, The Lessons of Tragedy, Statecraft, and World Order, co-authored with Hal Brands, just out now from Yale University Press.
Well, thanks so much for having me on today, Aaron.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Please check out the Texas National Security Review at tnsr.org.